So here's what we're doing, Chris. We're starting a series called Love Handles, and we're kind of playing off that a little bit. We all got some love handles, but what we're really doing is looking at it like, how do we pick up some heavy topics, and wrestling through a lot of different things that are not things that we want to stand on a stage and preach. They're conversations we want to have. It's like, how does love handle addiction? Whether that's an addiction maybe that I'm personally struggling with, or how does love handle an addiction of a family member or a good friend? We're going to look at how does love handle sexuality. We're going to look at how does love handle depression and suicide, and how does love handle racism. This week we're talking about the issue of how does love handle addiction. So that's the reason I wanted to pick your brain on it a little bit. I know a little bit of your story, a little bit of your background, and just whatever you feel comfortable kind of sharing with me, with my church, with the world. How do we best deal with this topic? Because we know it's a real topic. And I know in my church here at The Rock, we have a lot of people who are in recovery. We have a lot of people who have friends who need help with recovery. So I just want to pick your brain on it, man. So if you don't mind, if you would, because I know we're longtime friends, I will say this just to you as the church. I'm speaking to the church now, not to Chris. But the reason I love Las Vegas is because of you, dude. You know what I mean? Like, my very first experience with Las Vegas was coming out to speak for your youth group when you were at Canyon Ridge. But just tell me, and let the people of our church know, who are you? What are you currently doing? Just anything you want to tell us about yourself.
Well, it's good to be with you guys at The Rock today, and I am grateful, Josh, that you're allowing me this opportunity to come and speak. My name is Chris Duncan, and I'm currently the lead pastor of a church in Kokomo, Indiana called Crossroads Community Church, and have been here for the last 8 years. Prior to that, I spent 13 years in Las Vegas as overseeing a youth ministry there of students, and just had the privilege of doing that. And then before that, spent some time in the South in Kentucky, and doing some ministry there. So that's been my history and of church and doing some work stuff.
I forgot that you were in Kentucky. What part of Kentucky were you in?
Yes, I was in the Lexington area. So
okay.
If you everything from Lexington to Cincinnati. I was a little church between Lexington and Cincinnati, right in the middle, and then moved to Lexington for a couple of years. And then I was in the far eastern part of Kentucky, where the part where we enjoy all kinds of fun stuff. And
you were in Vegas 13 years, and I know you pastored and helped a lot of people who were dealing with addiction, whether that was gambling addictions, alcohol, drugs addiction, sex addictions, whatever it might be. So tell me just a little bit about just that time, whether that's your story, whether it's things that you've witnessed. Like, what does our church need to hear about when it comes to addiction?
Well, I think to give a little background into my history, I was one of those guys that was fortunately raised in a church setting, in a church environment, and went to college in a church environment, and even went into ministry in a church environment. But like everyone, I had some things inside of me that continued to try to woo me in ways that I didn't want to go. And ultimately, when I got out of college, it led me into a full-scale addiction. And so my addiction initially was an addiction to pornography. And I was one of those guys that would try to find a bookstore, or try to find a truck stop that sold pornography, and try to do that. And what I would do is I would buy something, I would look at it, I would I would then do something about it, and then I would feel guilty, and then I'd throw it away. And the problem that happened to me was that after a while of that cycle, the cycle was no longer satisfying enough. And so for me, the cycle continued, like most of us who struggle with some kind of an addiction, to where there may be a side of it that we look back and say, maybe it was harmless of me getting into it, but it was harmful to me ultimately in how I lived that out. And so I ended up turning it to give me pleasure. Instead, I would find myself buying. Then I realized I needed the real sex, and so that turned into all kinds of stuff, and eventually even prostitutes and things like that. And so the thing that happened to me, and what I've learned in this one of the things I've learned in this process is that most of us who struggle with some kind of an addiction, we feel first off that our addiction is the one addiction that God could never forgive. And so we think, whether my addiction's alcohol, whether my addiction's drugs, sex, shopping, whether my addiction's gossip. I mean, the thing about it is that an addiction, regardless of what psychology tells us an addiction is, we have a lot of even acceptable addictions in our society. And once we come to the realization of the brokenness of what it causes in our lives, and it replaces God in some way, what happens to us is that we then come to the realization, we say, okay, God, I've replaced you essentially with this. And the thing for us is that for me is that I learned in that process that I couldn't stop. I always had to go one step further. And the problem is that I'm shamed by the church, because I know that if I'm found out, then I'm out of a job, I'm out of life, I lose my family, I lose everything around me. And at the same time of the shaming that's happening there, I still have this animal inside of me that needs to be fed. And what I've learned about addictions is that addictions have a tendency to grow biggest in the dark. And so as long as you can leave your addiction in the dark, then the truth is you're going to continue to feed that thing over and over and over again. And it isn't until it's brought into the light. And one of the biggest reasons that most of us never bring an addiction into the light is because of fear and shame. We're afraid that if I bring this thing into the light, then all of a sudden everybody's going to run away from me. The people that I hang out with, the people that I know, my family, my friends. And so those pieces honestly keep us in the dark for so long. I recently, a guy here in the church that I'm a part of was telling me his story, and since the age of 10, he's now 53, since the age of 10, he could count on both hands the number of days that he had been sober in his life. And his addiction started in a very harmless way. Most of us would go, wow, what kind of family were you a part of? But his addiction started when he was age 5. His dad, the only time he ever connected with his dad is his dad would say, go get me a beer. And so he would. By age 6, his dad thought that it would be funny while his dad was hanging out with his buddies for him to have a drink. And so by the age 9, his dad thought it was great that his son could drink an entire beer and hang out with his buddies. And so here this guy is by age 10, needing anywhere from 3 to 5 beers a day, and realizing that that is the only way he could figure out to find acceptance. And then he's wondering why at age 53, he's been through 3 marriages. He's currently with a woman that won't marry him because she knows of his addiction and she doesn't want to live a life of that. And now the fear of him coming clean, because he has no idea what he's like without his addiction, because she likes me for who I am drunk, not for who I am sober. And the fear of him coming clean of that, and the shame of him now coming to the side of saying, you know what, I have to admit I have a problem. And so the life of the party is no longer acceptable. I've got to admit that I have a problem with this. And the thing that I've learned in this process, and for me, I was in a similar boat, in that there was a high that I got that, quite honestly, I liked the high, because for that brief moment, I felt complete acceptance. And I think this is one of the pieces that happens. One of the things about a person like me who is a recovering sexual addict is when you have a sexual addiction, the person that you are with never says no. And so the reality is that you already know that you're going to get that high. And so oftentimes it leads to greater highs, and you try greater things and all these kind of things. And this is one of the reasons why in today's culture we're oversexed in so many ways, is because what used to excite us before no longer excites us. And so we need something a little bit more. And that's a tendency that happens to us. And so for me, ironically, I had this happen prior to my first marriage. And as I moved into my marriage, I thought this will take care of everything. Because if my addiction is sexual, getting married should take care of that. The problem was I married a woman who quite honestly, she had her issues, because we all have issues. We're all broken in some way.
That's right.
But the point was, my issue was greater than her issue. And the reason that my issue was greater was because she saw that as a block to being able to heal in her issues. And so the problem that occurred was I learned, okay, now I have to squelch this thing. I have to keep it quiet. And so the learning that I had was, as long as you don't know that I'm struggling with this, then nobody knows. And I'm able to function in the terms that we use in society today. It's called a functioning alcoholic, but there's also a functioning addict. There are people who are addicted to painkillers who are functional, and they're probably listening to this right now. You're functional. You can take just enough, and people think you're normal, but you know that you're not normal. And the reason you don't want to stop is because there is a feeling that you get, of feeling in that moment, hey, I can accomplish something that I could not accomplish without this. And that is a driving factor for so many of us. And it keeps us in the dark, it keeps us filled with shame, and it keeps us filled with fear.
Wow. Let me just, there's so much that you just said there, Chris, that it keeps us filled with shame, it keeps us filled with fear, and it keeps us in the dark. I want to talk about, how do you get into the light then? I know the story that I'm preaching from this weekend is the story of the guy at the healing of the pool, where Jesus comes to him. Here's a paralytic, and he says, do you want to get well? You know what I mean? Like, are you ready to move to the next place? And we could read that and just pass by, well, of course he wants to get well, but maybe he doesn't, or maybe doesn't know how. For him it was an excuse, nobody can get me into the pool. How did you get from the dark to the light? How did you find healing in this issue? And how can others do that same thing, go from the dark to the light, to get well, to find the healing that can be found?
Well, there's a theologian by the name of Simone Weil, and Simone Weil said this, that two things pierce the heart. One is beauty, and one is affliction. And I think that, and you've asked the question well, Josh, by saying, do you want to get well? And I think that for most people, until they are pierced to the heart, either by affliction, and this is what happens to a lot of us, is that our lives fall apart. In the case of my ex-wife, she walked away, and in the case of many of us, we lose families. We can go back through and job loss. Tons of stuff that we lose, and enough affliction comes that we finally come to the place of going, okay, that's it. Stop. I want to get well. The other thing that happens is beauty, and this is the piece that I think the church misses. And the reason that I think the church misses it is because it isn't just affliction, but the beauty or the beauty of like a woman or a man. If you're single and you're going, wow, he's such a hunk, I want to be with him, or she's so beautiful, I want to be with her. I think the beauty comes in recognizing Jesus and recognizing how Jesus takes a look at people in the midst of their brokenness, and he loves them unconditionally. You can find story after story of people who see Jesus in this regard. A woman at the well a woman caught in adultery. And the fact that both of those stories surrounded themselves around a woman is amazing, considering in the New Testament, women were considered in some of the same regards as cattle. And so the truth is that Jesus had a sense of looking at individuals not just through their affliction, but looking at them through the lens of beauty, of saying, hey, you are worth more than this. Mm-hmm. And I think that ultimately some people get well because of afflictions. And you can show up at an AA group, an NA group, an SA group. You can show up and I've shown up at dozens of these things. In our ministry here at Crossroads, we run a pretty active Celebrate Recovery. And we have a lot of people who are sitting in Celebrate Recovery right now. And the reason they are is because they go, the court told me to be here. I've been afflicted enough. It's go to jail or go here. And I don't want the pain of jail, so I'll come here. Well, that's affliction. But it isn't until we, and this is one of the things that we try to do even at the church I'm at here, is we provide a free meal, and we just basically, when they show up at Celebrate Recovery, it's a big love fest. And the reason behind that is because I think beauty is the ultimate winner of understanding these things. And I remember with my wife, the reality of this all coming face to face one day a few years ago. And finally going, I got to stop. I got to stop hiding. I got to stop living in the dark. I've got to stop doing the things that I'm doing. And I just need to say, look, this is the real me. And the reality of what I experienced in that moment with my wife was a sense to where I thought she was going to run. I thought she was going to walk away. I thought I would lose my family. I thought I'd lose everything that I'd worked towards. Instead, in that moment, my wife looked at me and she said, I've never been more in love with you than in this moment. That beauty is what helps people to begin to be well. And the thing is, that's the turning point. That's not recovery from addiction. It's the point of turning and saying, now I'm ready to start. Now, there's some steps. We can talk about those in a moment, but that's the piece. And I think that's a powerful, powerful piece of recognizing. And so for two people, it's affliction or it's beauty. And I talked with a guy a few weeks ago who's had an opiate addiction for a number of years. And I said, so how'd you overcome it? I said, opiate's one of the toughest ones to overcome. How'd you do it? And the guy looked at me and he said, my best friend died. Okay, so that's affliction. Mm-hmm. He's standing over a casket and he was realizing, and he was basically telling me, I looked down at the casket and I thought, that's me any day if I don't quit. And it's that affliction. But ultimately for me, to help this individual say, even though that affliction is what turned you, it isn't until you totally fall in love and understand the beauty of who Jesus is that's going to help to keep you away from this addiction.
Yeah, and that's so rich because, I mean, you think about the beauty of Christ and the beauty of the grace of Christ and the beauty of the grace of people, that rather than shaming us and going, pushing us aside, saying, no, this is how Jesus sees you, you're turning, and let me come alongside of you as well, and to really talk about that's how love can handle. There's an opposite side of love that I want to talk about for a second, and that's the one who maybe isn't ready to get well. How does love handle that addiction? You know what I mean? Because there is a lot of, if I keep helping, I love them and I want to help them, but when helping hurts is a famous book out, how do we wrestle with that? Because we know the beauty of the grace of loving somebody through it can be a massive turning point. And I know that's a struggle that parents have when their kids are in addiction, a struggle spouses have when their spouse is in addiction. Anything you'd say towards that?
Well, I think that there's two sides to this of how this thing operates. There's the one side where people use the phrase tough love. That's where you turn your back on them and let them fall so far that eventually they come to the realization that they're an addict and they get changed. Well, the unfortunate piece of that tough love is that we're living in a society today where addictions are so great and the percentage of the population of people are so addicted that the problem of tough love is, in some cases, it becomes a death warrant to the very people who need the help the most. And so it's a tough component. I know this sounds really horrible, but the piece of it for me is probably looking at Luke 15. And in Luke chapter 15, there's three cool stories that Jesus tells. But Luke 15, verse 1 and 2 says this, that Jesus was followed around by tax collectors, which were the riffraff, right? Mm-hmm. And notorious sinners. And this made the religious elite upset. So then Jesus notices this, and he tells three stories. So story one is a story of a guy who has 100 sheep, loses one, runs after him. Story two is about a gal who's got 10 coins. She loses one, she tears up her house, she finds the coin. And then there's rejoicing in both of those. And then Jesus goes in to tell this story about the prodigal son. Any of us who've been a part of a church probably have heard this story of the prodigal son, a guy that comes to his dad and says, I want to take my stuff, I want to go away, give me my stuff and get me out of here. The guy, the Bible says he did wild living. That was the phrase that was used. And then a famine hits and the guy's eating. Basically, he can't even eat in the pods that these pigs are eating. The guy finds it attractive and goes, man, I'd love to just eat this. Dad's servants are eating more than I am. Well, the thing is then for the story, he returns home. And as he returns home, his dad finds him and runs after him. And so in this story, there's some things that we learn about this idea and this concept of love. And what I've learned is in the story, we wish there was more detail sometimes, because did the son, after the party was thrown and him coming back home, did he one day decide to say, you know what, Dad, thanks, I appreciate the party, I'm going out again? Because what most people don't understand about addiction isn't a one-sided issue. It is more like, instead of we're in Halloween, instead of the face of a pumpkin, addiction is more like the peels of an onion. And the idea behind addiction is that I may peel back a layer and then say, okay, I'm whole now, I'm ready to go. But the truth is I may not be ready at that time. And so the reality is I believe in the telling of those three stories that what we know, especially in story one, if you're going to connect those three stories, the guy that had 100 sheep and lost one, the truth is that Jesus will run after you every single time that he can to bring you back. And the tendency for most of us is to say, then let them go, and when they're ready to come back, we'll receive them back. Well, in story one, the guy left the 99 sheep and went after the one. And the truth is, the church has to continue to bring these folks in and unpeel the layers and recognize that maybe, because for me, I can't stand before you and say, hey, Josh, I've been addiction-free since I gave this up 22 years ago. I've had lapses in the course of that time, but what I've learned in the course of those lapses is I have to go straight back after a lapse and ask myself this hard question: what needs to be unpeeled from the next layer of onion that's in front of me? Because I can keep running down this road and eventually this road will lead to death. But God never wants any of us to be left alone to die. And that's where I think we kind of come up with this idea of saying, you know what, I'll run after you once, maybe 2 times or 3 times, but I'm done at 4 times, or what you pick your number. We all kind of have a number that we're done. And so, yes, the question is, do you want to be well? I may say to you now, Josh, I want to be well now, but you know what? 3 days from now, I may not want to be well. 10 days from now, I may not want to be well. And so the point is for me to understand that I have to continue to stay after this person, not with a nagging. Scripture tells us gentleness is the key here, that we continue to love these people and love those of us who are addicted over and over and over again. And it isn't until The first step to recovery is bringing this thing into the light. And the second step to recovery, for most people that didn't understand, once I bring this thing into the light, is to always keep bringing it into the light. So whenever I fall, don't live in the darkness again, bring it back to the light. You cannot recover unless you keep bringing this thing back to the light.
That's great. And you know, it is the balance between those stories, you know what I mean, of the shepherd running after the sheep every time, you know, the father standing with his eyes towards the horizon saying, I want my son home, you know what I mean, and looking at how do I keep my eyes out looking for the chance to help. How do I run towards my son the moment I see him, the moment I see the person in need. So great analogies between those two stories and putting those two together. So just one more question that I'm going to have to ask, and the question really comes down to this, Chris, is if you think about it, no problem. So the last question I really want to ask is this, because what I love about your story is you admit, man, I'm an addict. I've got this issue. I've wrestled through it. I brought it into the light. I found healing. I got to keep looking for healing. I got to keep peeling back the layers. I love that I'm sitting here talking to Chris, the pastor, Chris, the husband, Chris, the daddy, and that God is continuing to use you. And I know that there's people who think, well, there's no way God can forgive that. There's no way I can restart my life. There's no way I can move forward. You are living proof that God still uses people. You know, I am living proof that God still uses people. We're all messed up. We all make mistakes. We all have hurts, habits, hang-ups, things of that nature. But I want you to just share, you know, just that, the joy you get from that, but then also how you continue to stay strong on a daily basis as you walk out your recovery.
Well, first off, I recognize that because of my addiction, every time I get to tell this story over and over again, a couple of things happen. Number one, I know that this may be the last time I get to tell my story. You know, because of my past, there's always that chance that God's going to one day just have somebody show up and say, you know, Chris was this, and he did this, and this. And while I have confessed those things, if a group of people say, you know what, grace is over for you, then I know that my grace in Jesus Christ is sufficient, and my ministry may be done in that moment. That does not give me liberty to keep sinning. It just gives me an understanding. So every message I preach may potentially be my last, which gives me a little more of a New Testament perspective. You know, those guys were persecuted and they were going to die, and so they knew that there was a sense of intensity. And so that's one of the reasons why I guess in some ways I'm probably more intense than I normally would be, is because I recognize that. The second component for me that I see is that not just that every message could be my last, but what I'm learning, what I keep learning over and over again is I recognize that this message of brokenness, and that's exactly what it is. I'm a broken vessel, and the truth is, it is a message that hundreds upon hundreds of us are dying to hear. And these days, we're not looking for pastors that we can put onto pedestals. We're looking for pastors who can stand in the trenches with us and say, look, I'm struggling. I'm with you on this struggle. We're walking through this journey together. And the unfortunate piece is, yes, it's cost us some members at times, because there are those people that want a pastor on a pedestal, and they go, gosh, I know that guy. He's already told his story 4 times, and he's told me these are the things, and I can't serve or live under a leader like that. But what happens is, and again, this is not I don't say this out of arrogance by any means. Outside of Jesus, you can't find really a perfect story in the Bible. The Bible's filled with broken people, and the message is incredible with people all around that and Jesus surrounded himself with people who were broken. You think about it. I mean, Peter, he's a traitor, right? 3 times denied Jesus. Thomas stood there with Jesus, doubted. I mean, you think of Paul. I mean, Paul, in essence, was an accomplice to murder. In our society, we would have convicted him of second-degree murder. He would have spent time in prison, not because he was a Christian, but because of the fact that of second-degree murder. He was an accomplice to murder. And these are the guys and the gals that are leading the charge of the New Testament. And I recognize that God uses us broken people, because there's a scripture that says that when we reach the lost, our sins, many of our sins are covered over in those moments. And for me, while I'm a man of great sins, I want to reach as many lost people as possible to understand that. So how do I keep myself in check? Because the truth is, if I'm not in check, then I'm not healthy enough to lead a church. And that's the thing that I've come to the realization, that if there's a season in my life that I go back to old habits and old things, that I need to say, that's it. I can't be the leader of this church, because there are people who trust in what I'm doing. And so a couple of things that I've had to learn. The first one is this. The word is called triggers. All of us have triggers that move us back to a time to where we were doing something that pulled us away from God. And when those triggers tend to come back, we need to at least acknowledge them. And so when you think of something, if you were a person that, say, you like to go drinking with your high school buddies, and so every year the big thing was it you used to go out and drink, and you remember the fall, you remember the beautiful fall weather, and that's when we went to go out and do that. And so, whenever it becomes fall again, and you hear that, you sense the smell of the smoke of a fire, and you're thinking, man, I just love to have some more beer, because that was the best time ever. Those are triggers. And so we have to recognize when those triggers are. And so for me, I have to bring triggers into the light. So if I'm in a situation, because I travel a lot, and so if I'm in an airport and there's a very well proportioned lady who's dressed in a way that she probably is trying to attract somebody, she's definitely attracting my eyes. My wife and I will pretty much almost immediately look at each other in that moment, and my wife will notice if I've looked or I haven't looked, and we will affirm in that moment what it was that I saw or didn't see. And the reason is because I need to bring even my triggers into the light. And so that's because my eye went, that doesn't mean that my heart needs to go with it too. I just need to bring the triggers into the light. The second thing is this, identity. And Jesus owns us. And I'm happy to be a slave to Christ. Because when I was a slave to myself, things didn't turn out so well. And so the reality is, who does Jesus say that I am? And in Romans 8, we know that nothing separates me from the love of Jesus Christ. Nothing. Not my sin, not my arrogance, not my ignorance. Nothing separates me from the love of Christ. And Paul says in Philippians 4, these are two of my favorite verses. I think it's verse 8 and 9. He says, whatever is right, whatever is noble, whatever is true, think on these things. You see, in a sexual addiction, the problem with sexual addiction, and it's the same with most addictions, is our thought patterns are ultimately what bring back the actions of our past. And so if I'm thinking in a fantasy of going, man, remember those moments, this is where triggers come in, and I don't start thinking of things that are right, things that are pure, things that are noble, if I don't think in those directions, I will let my mind take off and move in a direction that someday will lead me down a path that I don't want to go again. And so those two things are the biggest things that I tell people. Know your triggers, bring them to the light, and 2, think in a way that Christ wants you to think. You have to take, and Paul says it again, where he says, take every thought captive. Remember him saying that? Mm-hmm. There's something behind it. Because what happens for us in addictions is it's not taking a thought captive. If my addiction, if I struggle with depression, or anxiety, and I take medicine for depression or anxiety, and because I can take some other kind of medicine to make me feel better. And the point is, if I know that I'm heading down that road, I need to bring that to the light, because if I don't, and I just keep running down that road of depression, then ultimately that will lead me right back to where I was before, because I'm not thinking what's right, what's noble, what's pure. Same thing true with alcohol, same thing's true with shopping, the same thing's true with, I mean, you go down the list of the kinds of things that we do, that we make mistakes with, and that's because we didn't take every thought captive. And so that's the idea. That's Romans 12:2. That's the idea of bringing those things together.
Well, dude, I appreciate that. I mean, that's a wealth of wisdom, and I know it's going to be very beneficial. It helps me prepare to best preach this weekend, but it also puts a tool that is available to our church and to our people to help them really wrestle through this issue and realize how love handles addiction. So man, I just thank you for doing that, man.
Hey, man, I'm happy, and anytime I can come to the Rock and hang out in sunny South Carolina, I'm happy to do it. Please make it sometime in January, February, or March, because that's the time that Jesus calls me to warmer weather, and so that would definitely be a good time to be there.
I hear you, bro. I hear you. So, all right, man. Thanks, brother.